Hello, I'm Phyllis and I'm going to be demonstrating how to make signs. Now, on the board before me, I have a political sign that I've repurposed. And I've gone through several steps of repurposing this sign. And hopefully, I'm going to find some of the steps that I can show you. Yeah, well, maybe I won't. I started off with a political sign that a friend gave me. Actually, my friend gave me several hundred of these. All right. This is a typical political yard sign. Very glossy finish, very, very difficult to repaint. So you have to treat these signs with something that will make the paint stick so that you can repaint them. There's two ways to do it. One is to get a spray product called self-etching primer. You can get it at Home Depot, Walmart, and some hardware stores. Anything that sells Rust-Oleum will probably have this, and it's a great product. You spray it on, and it etches into this shiny surface so that paint will stick. Oh, and here's an example of what it looks like when you're done with this one step. After spraying and letting it dry, which only takes about 10 minutes, I put a coat of primer on, which is just a very basic white house paint. And after that's dried on both sides, you can see that was just one coat with the self-etching primer. The other way of scoring this so paint will stick is an old trick. Vinegar and a sponge, that kind that has an abrasive back. And I'll just dump some vinegar on and scrub, scrub, scrub. And for some reason, this will help the paint stick, but it will not give you that primer coat, so you're going to have to use more coats of paint in order to cover over this high contrast, very dark background and white paint. So that's why I prefer the spray primer, and it just goes forever and ever. You can probably do several dozen signs with just one can, and it's about $5 or $6, which is great. All right, so that's that. The other thing about the vinegar is sometimes you can finish a whole sign, and if the temperature is something and the sign hasn't cured, the whole thing will just peel off, which is not good. You don't want to put the effort in only to see the darn thing peel off. So the other thing, I make my signs with this Cricut machine. Now, Cricut is a die cutting machine, and I purchased this, I think, at a Joann Fabric, maybe AC Moore. And I have a mat. I put on a piece of acetate, cut it, use my computer, and I make the designs that I want. And I usually use the stencil font. Lay that in, put it in, and it does all the cutting. Wonderful. Love it. That's a whole nother episode. That was a lot. That was what I call a steep learning curve. And a lot of calls to customer service. But eventually I got good at it. So here, what you're going to see is a sign for Lori Brown. And you say, but you've already done it. Yes, I have, because it's a two-coat process. All right, we'll get rid of that. What I use is a makeup sponge. Now, every time you see somebody doing stenciling, they're always going to use this really fancy little pounce. I don't use fancy pounces. I use makeup sponges because I don't use fancy paint. I use house paint. This happened to be $10. It was an overstock, and it was like $50 thing of paint. $10. I'm loving it. So I go to Walmart and I get Swispers. And you're thinking, why Walmart? Because they don't carry this brand in Walgreens. They have another brand which is a little bit more expensive, but this one is very soft, very pliable, and it's all about the bubbles. Soft sponges, big bubbles. I'll show you the other one. The ones that you get at Walgreens are much more dense. Very, very dense, but it's great for detail work. We'll get into that. So right now, this particular sign has a layer of the spray primer it has a layer of the white primer, and it has 2 coats of the maroon. And then I laid down this stencil, and I just took my little sponge, tap, 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 scrape it off, and I do 2 layers, just kind of basically going just a gentle tap. This is the second layer, and you'll see why I do this the way I do. For some reason, because the bubbles are just a little bit bigger with this sponge, it dries fairly fast. This will be dry within 10 minutes. So I try to get this done. If I'm doing a series of signs, I start with one, and I wait 10 minutes, and then I go back and I do the second coat. I don't do 10 signs all in a row, and I'll explain why. So I started doing this because a guy named Leo Kokunas wanted me to make him some signs out of foil back 1-inch insulation board, rigid fiberglass insulation board. So I said, sure. And at that time, I didn't have the plastic Cricut stuff. So I just bought stencils at Staples. Worked out just fine. So I learned I needed to get several different sizes. I think I ended up with 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch, 7-inch. And there were some that I just said, hey, you know, if I'm doing a lot of letters, a lot of words, it's handy to have 2 packages. That way I'm not trying to swap out letters. So this isn't, did I do that one? Yeah, I did that one. The other good thing about doing these slowly is you don't want to wet your sponge so much that the paint is going to slide under the edge of the stencil. That causes a lot of problems. Not so much problems, but extra work, because you go back through after the second coat has dried, and now you have all these little dribs and drabs you have to cover over with, you know, a fine paintbrush. Now, I will do that, but if I'm really good and I don't overdo it, there isn't a lot that I have to clean up. So it's worth it to just take the time. But you can still do a sequence. So my sequence is, get your base coats down, do 1 stencil once, let it dry, come back and do it a second time. It doesn't matter how long the first coat sits there, but it does matter how long the second coat sits there, because the letters work because they have these little bridges that attach to make the sign stable, so that like the inside of the O, it's actually going to stay put while you stencil. So these little bridges have to be filled in. The gaps have to be filled in, or your sign, a stenciled sign, will just look amateurish. Okay. So that's my second coat. Says, vote Laurie Brown, town meeting member. All right. Now, because I have so many of these, I have a bowl of water over here. I'm just going to drop this in, give it a couple of squeezes so that I don't, this stuff is going to turn to plastic very quickly. And then I'm going to take one of these. Now this is that other brand that's very sturdy. It's a good thing. Sturdy is good. Now I'm going to peel this off and I'm going to lay it aside. Okay. What you can't see from there is that there's little bits of paint that have stuck on the underside. If I go and lay this down on the next sign in the series, even if I just move it to adjust it so that it's even, it's going to smear. So I'm going to give this a couple of minutes to dry. Won't take long. And in the meantime, because the second coat is still wet, what I can do is I can fill in these gaps and you almost won't see them. The edges will blur if you just touch them with a little bit of paint. And I cut that sponge to fit. So this was probably once a regular sponge, and I just take scissors to it. It's a sponge, no big deal. So I start on the left-hand side, and I work this way, because I tend to lean in and make a mess. So I had to put a rubber band so that this thing, and I just tap, 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 and that's it. This is probably the most delicate work that I do, and I don't do it that well. But you'd be amazed at just how much more professional this looks. Now, if you wait for the sign to dry, and if you have like a cardboard stencil that has a really big gap, you're gonna have to go over that gap 3 or 4 times before you don't see the dark color underneath it. But if you do it while it's wet, and you get the wet edges together with a little bit of extra paint, it just disappears. You do it once and you're done. And the nice thing about the stencil that font that I picked to use with the Cricut is that I think the gaps are like 1/32 of an inch, which makes them real easy. But let's see if I can find. Look at the size of the gap in a cardboard stencil. Compared to this one, it's huge. So if you're using cardboard, it's even more important to fill in the gaps while the paint is wet. So I'm just going to go through here. Look at the little brown. And if I end up with a size of a letter that's really small, I just cut the sponge so it's smaller. Cut it to fit whatever you need. And probably don't do this thing first thing in the morning after you've had a bunch of coffee, because you do need fairly steady hand. But it should only take about 5 minutes. Yeah, so Leo told me that, could I make him some signs? So I got my cardboard stencils. And it was Leo Kokunas for county commissioner. Oh my God, that goes back. But he knew about the fiberglass insulation board because he helped his daughter make theater sets. And apparently that's how they make theater sets, so that they're beautiful, they're paintable, and easy to move, easy to set up. That you? It's not me. Well, we can ignore that. So, all right, this is going on pretty good. I usually don't do this many words, but it's important when you're kind of laying it out to. I like to center things unless there's an image, but images are not easy. At least I haven't mastered them yet. Anytime I have a question, I go to YouTube. That's it. And I just put in the terms that I need, and all of a sudden, there it is, for the most part. All right, so I'm going the other way with this. As long as this paint is still fairly wet, it's going to blur, it's going to be fine. And if it, wow, this one really did come out good. Sometimes, when working with the cardboard stencils, I end up with a lot more paint going underneath the edges, and it's a lot more touch-ups. But it's just part of the process. It's something that I have learned to accept. And it's nice because I still don't have to tape out everything. I used to do signs, then I would use painter's tape just to get the straight lines. And works pretty good. I'm trying to think where some of my big stencils are. They're huge. This is one of the smaller Trump ones. There's another big one in there. But I've made probably several hundred of these over the years. Just because what happens is, if you go to buy these signs and you just like need a dozen, they're outrageously expensive. But this way, you get to say what you want, you get to have as many as you want, and for the most part, people, I need something smaller. Oh, hang on. All right, I'm going to take another one. Is that one soft? Scissors. Scissors. I have small letters. I need a smaller sponge. That's good. This is the part where I get dirty. But that's okay. Oh, that's nice. Very nice. Now, yeah, so I made Leo some signs, made them out of plywood, made them out of this fiberglass insulation board. Then I learned that it's easy to hold at a standout. You can hold those big signs. Typically what I do is I go into Home Depot and I pick out a 4x8 sheet, and then I say, well, I get 2 free cuts, right? I said, yes. I said, well, can you put it on the saw? And I need it 1/3 and then 1/3. So it'll end up being 4 feet by 32 inches, 4 feet by 32 inches. And they do it, and it fits in the back of my Honda, and it's wonderful. And then I come home, and because it has a foil back, paint will not stick to it. So I always pick up the spray self-etching primer or the vinegar, whatever. Like I said, I love the primer. It's really good stuff. And after that, I start with my layer of any kind of cheap. Doesn't have to be outdoors. It can be indoor stuff. Typically, you wouldn't put a fiberglass sign or an insulation board sign out in the weather. I've seen people do it. They've done it successfully. I've seen people mount them on the back of a truck, and I've seen the paint peel off because it doesn't like going at 50 miles an hour, etc. And it's like, okay, lesson learned. There's some things you can do and some things you can't do. So Leo won that election. I wish he had won re-election. We'd be in a much better state, Cape Cod, than we are now. Alright, so I'm getting these, just going back, there was a blob of paint that was going to take a little bit of time, so using that as a repository. Okay, over there. So I'd start usually in the middle and work out. Oh, I forgot that one up here. Little cap. And I save this, as you can see, that is going to be nice and dry by the time I go and lay it out on the next board and start the process again. I wanted to have some of these started so that every part of the process could be watched. Almost done. Almost done. Now most of the sign companies, you'll notice they're going to have a 1/2 inch white border around the signs, which is great. I mean, I wish I could do that, but they do that by not putting any paint on the border. It's not that it's white, it's just that it's blank. It's the original transparency of the sign itself. That's because the paint around the edges is the most likely to chip. And, you know, I could leave the paint out there. I could tape it off so that blank stuff would still exist. But by the time I do the spray, it's going to shed onto that area, so I've just decided I'm not going to bother. And if I put the white paint on there, which I've done in the past, it's going to be the first to chip. So what I end up doing is having signs that reach out to kind of like the edges of the sign, the letters, and just simply not worry about it. Okay. Yeah, this is nice because I can just push the paint around the gaps and it moves into place, which is what I like. Almost done. Almost done. And when you buy a sign that's all made, it is gorgeous, I will say that. And they are very expensive when you do one off. Okay, I'm just going to cover that. These are the containers from the deli slices. You know, Hormel or whatever, 8 ounces of ham. Works out. Okay, so this is Vogler brand. That's the first one. Now I'm going to get another one and show you now what happens when I do the next one. So the sign is dry. This is the next board. Now, when I go to lay out the sign, because it's just dry enough, I can shift it, I can move it, I can put it into place. And I've kind of marked it where that is. And I take my trusty ruler and I look at the bottom edge of the letters here. And then I just line it up so I don't even look at the numbers. I'm just using this as a reference. Okay, I gotta shift this one up a little bit. Just, I turn it until it actually works. It tends to stick to the sign a little bit. Okay, vote Lori Brown. I already know from, yep, pretty good. I am a fan of good enough. And then I have these little tiny tabs of tape, and I just push those down. And I start the process again with the Swispers. Let's see, do I have one that's wet? Oh God, they're both wet. Oh, hang on, I see one over here. Then it's the same thing. The easygoing sponge for the big letters, and then the dense sponge for the gaps. If I'm doing a lot of big ones, sometimes I'll just pick up the paint like this, blot it here, and you can dab it on. Some of these get pretty heavy. And just zap. Sometimes the stencils have a very narrow margin around the edges, so you just want to be careful you don't overshoot the mark. You want to get the paint in the middle where the letters are, and not on the edges, because again, it's a cleanup chore. Nobody likes cleanup chores. So there's only about, less than a ½ inch over here. And the nice thing about these sponges is that they have a straight edge. And they just kind of want to hang out and do what you want them to do. That's good. So I started making these for Jeff Deal. I think I made him 30 big signs when he was running for Senate. Everybody thought, wow. But as you can see, this doesn't take a lot of talent. This is just more persistence than anything. And you can have fun with images. I think I did a shamrock. I did an apple. Every time I have to go back to YouTube and say, all right, how do you do this? Put the query words in. Sure enough, it comes up. And I do the signs for the farm stand, which can be nice. And Jay will say, all right, we need a sign that says, okay, no problem. So this is going fairly quickly. It doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said, it's more important that it be a light coat so that it doesn't scoot underneath. And pretty much you don't have to wash the stencil. I used to do a lot of washing the stencil. I think I could go about 10 or 12 impressions, and then I would kind of flip it over and scrape the paint that kind of accumulates around the edges. But for the most part, it's not a problem. These particular gaps are really tiny. They're not robust, so I would have to be very careful cleaning off the edges of a sign like stencil like this. All right, almost done. And what will happen is once this is done, it's almost like, all right, go back to the beginning and repeat. Almost finished. I've never used a pounce. It looked very intimidating. I'm sure if you get the hang of it, it's great. But when I saw this on YouTube, I said, oh yeah, this is what I need. And it has turned out great because it creates bubbles in the paint, and the bubbles dry much faster. And they just have a cleaner color than if you use a brush. A brush literally lays down paint and this literally lifts up the paint in the bubbles in the sponge. Okay, so that's that one. And I'm just gonna, not too messy, just put that up to dry. Yep, stay up there. Stay up there. And that one's there. Where's my other one? So this is, I'm gonna cover this. Throw that in the bucket. So when it comes to doing any of the layers, I get usually just a can of paint. This kind of a roller, I love these. I get these at Home Depot, and you can get the replacement rollers for like $1, maybe $1.50, $3 for a package of 2. And they actually fit inside here, which means I don't have to have a tray. And I just push the paint up and then just let it roll. And again, it's actually doing bubbles, which is great. And once again, I don't make it pretty, just make it covered, because it's going to have a second coat. And again, this is going to dry nice and quick. But when you're dealing with double sides, it's twice the work. And just push the paint up, and then backstroke. That's good. And then set that up to dry. So I will do like 4 or 5 of these and just set them up along the wall. Go have a cup of tea, cup of coffee, do a chore, whatever, come back, they're dry, throw another coat of paint on them, walk away. That's why it's kind of crazy to do this. Everybody says, I want to help. It's a walk away project. Oh, these little baggies, they're wonderful. They're a fold and close, not a Ziploc bag. Again, you get them at Walmart. They're super cheap. I hope they don't take them off the market. But I put the paint roller in, and I push it up towards the edge, and then I just pinch it so that there's no air. These things will stay soft without washing them for weeks. It's wonderful. So I have a series of these. I have them in blue, white, maroon, yellow, whatever. It works. And it keeps it fresh from one project to another. And I pretty much do the same thing with the white. What have I done? Let's see. I scrubbed one of these sides. Which side did I scrub? Do you remember which side I scrubbed? No? Okay. We don't know. It's a mystery. Well, we'll find out. You know what? Because if it doesn't work, it'll be an object lesson of what not to do, which is also good. Yeah. So this is the larger. This is the 4-inch. That little one is the 3-inch. Much bigger. Again, you get the package of replacements. They're just great to have. Boy, if I put vinegar on there, I didn't put a lot, because usually I can see a trace. Again, this is my stuff, and we'll see what happens. This is thick. Love thick. Ooh. Not bad. And you can see, all right, again, object lesson. This doesn't happen when I have that spray primer. You're going to see it pulling away from the sign. Yeah, and it's even worse if you don't use vinegar. Sometimes you have to see the mistakes in order to say, well, I can do it better. Well, believe me, I've tried. All right, and you see how the paint has pulled away because it was a very highly glazed surface, and it needed to be scored. It needed to be scratched. The vinegar would scratch it, but not as much as the self-etching primer. So, I don't know. I may be able to go over that with a second coat of primer, but I would do that before I would put on any of my fashion color. What else can we say? Because that other one came out so good. There's really not a lot of mistakes on it. I might go and just clean up the little edges after it dries. Little tiny ridges. But my feeling is at 40 miles an hour, if you're standing on the street corner, no one's going to notice. Now, if you're holding them up, you look at it and say, from 10 feet away, is anybody going to notice? Yes. If the answer is no, move on and do something important in your life. Don't spend it with paint. Because if nobody's going to notice, I think that's okay. The little bridges has got extra paint that's going to take a little bit longer to dry. But overall, that's your finished product. So there you go. And I hope you enjoyed this. And I hope if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. Okay? Bye.